Would it be able to be called a right if it were mandatory forced? For X. If it were mandatory to vote, creating possible consequences for those who don't. Would that still qualify as having a right? You can still choose who you vote for, but what if your options are limited? Not to mention if you already are being pushed to vote, who wouldn't say there's a chance that there would be extra pressure to vote for one side than the other? If young voters would be pressured to vote, they could become a stepping stone for those who have power over them. Another question is, what is having a right to you? If there's anything wrong with the text, I apologize. English is not my first language. P.S. Please don't get pissed or mad. I'm just curious about people's POV. At that point it's probably a civic duty. Tangentially, it makes me think of jury duty. It's compulsory, but for the purposes of protecting a right, in that case, the right to a jury of your peers. In every country with mandatory voting you can leave your ballot blank. You just have to submit one. Not to mention if you already are being pushed to vote, who wouldn't say there's a chance that there would be extra pressure to vote for one side than the other? Question mark. Broadly, this is a pretty nonsensical question. No one would say Australians don't have voting rights. A right can also be an obligation. An obligation can also be a right. Neither is necessary nor precluded by the other. Enforcing our rights is the most important function of a government. The rights you enjoy are only available to you by virtue of the laws set up to protect them and the enforcement of those laws. Otherwise the only rights you would be able to enjoy would be those you can defend on your own. That is not how US democracy works. Part of the First Amendment is to protest by not voting at all. Only showing up to a polling station is mandatory. There are legal ways to spoil the ballot on purpose, for example if you tick more people when you are tasked with voting for one. Or in Australia, as I have recently read, you can just leave the place right after receiving the ballot. No need to even the ballot box. So you are not forced to exercise the act of correct, lawful voting. I think you could argue that you still have an obligation duty to vote, but a right to vote none of the above or otherwise write in a candidate. That avoids most of the issues with mandatory voting that you list. You'd have a right to vote for the elected officials of your choice. You're not obligated to vote for anyone you don't want to, even if it were mandatory. What I consider rights are what are sometimes called negative rights, restraints on the government or other persons from taking action against me. I don't consider things the government gives to you, welfare, healthcare, etc., to be rights, and I certainly would not consider something that was mandated to be a right. That said, I do support making it easier to vote. Like a national holiday on voting day and early voting. It shouldn't be mandatory though. And people who would rather stay home than go vote wouldn't be responsible voters anyway. A right is a power or freedom that cannot be taken away or denied from you except in certain circumstances, such as when it conflicts with somebody else's right to something. However, at the same time I think it's also possible that this right could also be mandatory, at which point it also becomes an obligation. Rights are something you get from society. Obligations are something you owe to society. In a case like voting, I can see there being arguments that it can fall under both. Democracy gives you things, but you also have to give back to help keep it. Personally, I'm of the opinion that mandatory voting would constitute compelled speech, so in the US at least, it'll probably never happen because you have the affirmative right not to do it. That said, mandatory voting would probably be a civic good if you were explicitly given the option to affirmatively not vote as an alternative, specifically because it would make inhibiting others voting more difficult since you'd be compelling them to commit a crime. The right to do something implies the right not to do it. A right is something that the government can't take away from you and still be called a democratic government. It doesn't preclude society from treating you a certain way because of the choices you made. I'd be fine with voting being compulsory. Like maybe you get issued a citation if you don't, like a parking ticket. Or you get a break on your taxes if you do. So if you didn't want to, you wouldn't really have to. but it would incentivize more people to do it. No. A right to do something always includes the right to not do something. I enjoy our religious freedoms in this country by not being religious. The right to vote includes the right not to vote. I think when you do that you have to include an option that says I choose nothing, none of the above. I do think you'd get a minority of people who actually do that though. And I think we'd find out where this country really stands on issues and parties. The United States is based on the idea that government is a necessary evil, that the nature of man is unjust, that everyone must give up some of their absolute freedoms to all the government to serve society by choosing the least evil options while protecting society from unjust men. Rights are a construct to protect society from the unjust nature of the very men who might be elected to serve as representatives officials in the government. It's well recognized that the right to freedom of speech equates to the right from speech. Anything mandatory forced is not a freedom or a right. Then it is a responsibility, the flip side of a right. Really, voting is already the duty or responsibility, it's just not mandatory. You have a responsibility to vote implemented in your hypothetical case by making it mandatory, but arguably we already do, and in return you have a right to representatives in government that you had equal influence in selecting. I feel like if it's a protection for others to do a thing that prevents harm to ourselves, it's a right. The right to vote would still be limited to citizens, over 18, etc. It's still a right even if it is an obligation for those who have the right. Even if you do vote, there are both safeguards for you just to do something really dumb. Like the 14,000 people that voted for Harambe, the dead gorilla, in 2016. In many circumstances you may have the right to a jury trial. Often the other party has the right to a jury trial as well, in which case you may not be able to opt out of that right. Voting is you expressing your opinion on who you want to represent you in government. Compulsory voting is typically a requirement for you to put your name on a piece of paper and put it in a box. These are very closely related, but are still distinct acts. Every government in the world will require you to file some paperwork at some point in your life. Some more than others. No government that I know of will require you to express your opinion. The problem with compulsory voting: what if you don't like the current status quo? Then forcing you to vote is forcing you to legitimize the status quo. After all, don't some people say there's little practical difference between the parties? I think it would be a powerful message if only 20 of the electorate voted. That would make those in power very nervous, because they could not say they had a mandate. Knowing that there was a huge mass out there that sat out an election would mean that at any moment, a demagogue could harness that mass. You have a right to drive and must have a license. And if you can drive well, respect the rules, you get a license to do so. Screw up and you lose that right. I want that. If you do not want to drive, you do not have. I want that too. Same with voting. Well, rights aren't real or anything, they don't exist, you can't measure or observe them, so there's no way to answer the question. Whatever enough people call a right is a right. In general, a right should be something you may assert as appropriate, and, again, in general, this should not at any point compel you to assert that right. I cannot think of any reason to compel a participation in a vote, and if you never vote, you should still be able to vote at any time you decide to in the future. Sounds like Africa. Can't say I saw it gets great results. You might work up a chart of the countries and the results. Fascist is so close to fashion, it's confusing. As far as the voting question goes, you can always vote for none of the above. ETA talking about the US. No idea if that's an option in other countries. No. Rights have the option of being exercised. I understand what I'm saying is a very generalized statement, but it's sufficient enough for non-overly pedantic people.